This is going to be the fourth installment of the dueling video series, the Duelio series, and we're going to kind of preface this. We probably should have started with this video. Honestly, we should probably just go back and make this number one, but we're not going to do that because we are scatterbrained ADHD man. So you get what you get, but nobody's asked the question yet, but I'm sure people wonder why is the 109s kind of like the preferred go-to 1v1 me role playing, and the reason for that is because the 109s represent a good middle ground of performance and ergonomics that have the right characteristics to set up for like good duels. The plane itself has a high degree of controllability without being completely on rails, like something like the K84 where you just pin the stick to the rear with combats off and that's it. And the turn performance and the energy retention is just the right amount where you can have multiple solutions to kind of very similar fights. The strengths of this plane are essentially that you can do a lot with it, and there isn't necessarily one predefined line that will always get you the same result. Now, in order for this to actually make sense, I think it is necessary to compare the 109 to some other planes that are maybe, I would argue, not as good at dueling, that maybe are a little bit more one note. Planes like the F4U4B and the Typhoon Mark 1B, I would argue, are not nearly as balanced at dueling because both planes favor a very aggressive strategy. Typically speaking, in both planes, the first attack wins or it will result in a mutual head on. The landing flaps of the 4B are so strong that you're able to cut in really hard for attacks that don't look like they're there. And then the Typhoon, because of the roll rate, doesn't really have the agility to change trajectory quick enough to make counterattacks. So those are planes that are like maybe a little bit too maneuverable. Things like the Zero probably also come into play, but honestly, I don't play them, so I don't really know. And then like on the opposite end of the spectrum is going to be planes like the FW190D and the P63 series that are going to favor more or less like passive strategies because they're much harder to force attacks with, and the ergonomics just kind of like aren't there. You pull a little bit too hard in the 190 and it wants to throw itself out of the sky. The P63 also has a very similar problem. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't duel in these planes, but just realize that if you're trying to refine a particular set of skills, there's going to be a kind of like a meta result. At the same time, I would argue that the 109F4 is it's the most fun for dueling, but it's also the one that probably favors a more aggressive strategy as opposed to the 109G6, which is a little bit more methodical as far as I am concerned. So basically what it boils down to, it's the possibility of using the plane to force different situations through trajectories that ends up making 109 duels more interesting. There's a dichotomy that exists where a good aggressive player can beat a good passive player and vice versa, and it's something that maybe just doesn't exist with a bunch of other planes to the same extent. Now, with all that being said, there's a lot to unpack there because I just laid out that there is an aggressive playstyle and there's a passive playstyle. So, what's the difference between aggressive and passive? It's one of those terms that gets thrown around a lot, and it's something that most of us kind of take for granted that people understand what it means. And it's a characterization of player behavior that doesn't really have to be precisely identified amongst duelers because it ends up being just one of those experiences, ends up being very self evident. But to simplify things to an unnecessary extent, an aggressive player is going to build the best offense that either results in an early attack or securing early position. On the other hand, a passive player is going to focus on building a defense that cannot be attacked and then winning the fight through an energy advantage and slow marginal gains in turn rate that will eventually end up with a nice pure one attack from the 6 o'clock that can't be avoided at that point. It's a very cautious way of playing, but it's also a very safe way and it's very viable in tournaments. Anyways, we talked about position, so NFTs is what I mean by position. You put the enemy plane in front of you. If it's in front of you in the green zone, you're fragging. If they're off to your sides, you can still fight from there. And then if they're directly behind you in the red zone, that's kind of you're boned. So usually you don't want to start with a guy in your red zone. Now, when we practice symmetrical duels, we always start with the neutral merge, when both planes start with the same speed, the same energy, because this generates the most opportunity for a fair fight. If you start with the same plane directly behind you, there's a certain point where the other guy just wins. It's not really necessarily all that fun. That, and even if you start with a neutral merge, there will be a point where the other guy gets behind you and you can practice your defensive skills. So a lot of this is transitioning between your offense and your defense. I know I made it seem like passive and aggressive was exclusively one or the other, but the truth is that they're not. There are times to go on the offense and the defense, but understanding that this is a good position to initiate a fight from if you don't have like a pure 6 start means that you can apply it to random EC battles. When you have a guy that is trailing you, it makes more sense, especially if he's catching you, instead of just trying to completely run away, to lose a little bit of energy to force a neutral start. Because if you can start from a neutral position, if he makes mistakes, you can exploit them. And if he doesn't know exactly what to do, and by the way, most people in Sim just don't, you have a pretty good start. And if you watch some of my other videos, you see this in the P47 and whatnot. The other thing to understand about position is energy and position are related to each other, but it is possible to have an energy advantage that is offset by a positional disadvantage. So in this case, blue has done a bunch of turns to conserve energy, but in the process, he has given up the position to red so that red is behind him. And yes, he has 500 Figgy Newtons of altitude over him, but in order to reverse the situation, in order to turn around, it's actually going to cost him more. This is something that becomes really apparent because it's always a challenge to balance. Do you want to fight for position? Do you want to fight for energy? And how do you maintain and balance the position, the energy, and the attacks and the defense against each other so that you end up in a spot that you can fight from? Now, the typical dueling start that I show is usually the diving start. This is kind of like, this is the one that's the most fun to practice, that kind of generates the most shot opportunities and allows you to do a lot of things. But the way that this typically starts out is you start with the diving merge. And the reason for this is essentially that caching all your altitude into speed and getting below the other guy, even just slightly, would usually generate a opportunity for an early attack. And if you're an attacker enjoyer like I am, we want to end these duels as quickly as possible. And the logical conclusion, if both people are trying to out attack the other, they're both are going to try to secure that bottom position because that gets the first attack. Now, as things transition, as I have these circle points here, these are points where potential attacks exist, and these are like kind of like the crossover points where the planes cross over and then you transition to something else. But if you play this correctly, if you do the full start and nobody gets a good attack in the ascent, one plane might end up above the other, and it means that blue can play a strategy where if he doesn't give up too much position, he ends up with a little bit of an energy advantage over red, and then he can capitalize on it, where if he plays it wrong, he can end up with an energy advantage, but he's also just in front of red and he gets shot down. This is something that happens pretty often. Now, this is kind of looking at the top of the toilet bowl from the top, and ideally, if you end up and maintain a more or less neutral position, this is neutral position in the circle itself, where we're just kind of staring at each other from across the canopy, the guy that has more energy should be favored to win the horizontal, and the spiral is going to go up and then it's going to go down. And looking at your position in your rate, this is the way that I look at it. And basically, an aggressive start is prioritizing gaining position early on, where even if red has the energy advantage, you can still cook them. But if you don't gain enough and you don't play it correctly, you can still lose. Anyways, here's some examples of very aggressive duels. It's me, it's Biscuit, and we're doing kind of the same thing. I've been trying to refine my ability to maybe win at being aggressive, and in this case, he gets the first attack position, and I try to defend at the last second. I try to get above him so that if I stall above him and I get a follow-up, I can get it. But Biscuit's really dangerous in that first attack position, and if you give an aggressive duelist the first attack position, they can very readily exploit it. And this time I get to be first attack enjoyer, and I get the kill there. And the duel we have rendered 2 duels in like 30 seconds basically. And the same thing, but the first attack doesn't always pay off. Being aggressive is inherently risky. It's kind of the better strategy for random battles, because ending the fight the soonest is the best way to not get third-partied. But I think this here is an example where I am not quite successful at defending against it. But even though I'm not, he doesn't get the damage, and I'm going to roll in for a follow-up. And I get a follow-up, and I don't hit it, and at this point, I am cooked. Same thing, this time, it's going to pay off, and this is going to be an example of where he's playing for the first attack, and he gets the first attack position, but I immediately start playing for the second attack. I'm trying to defend against it as best as I can. I haven't quite mastered making sure that I can just not get hit, but he misses that. He concedes an advantage, and I come in from the vertical, and I gorilla pull into him, and I get the follow-up, and I'm also in like a really good position here, so even if he doesn't J out, we're going to be chilling. Now, this is going to be kind of like what's typical of a more passive player. I had actually just go to watch tournament replays to find this, but instead of doing the diving merge, Samuel is going to do a level merge, and we're going to get the climbing spiral. We're basically starting at a slower speed at the top. Jerry is going to gain a position. This is like what I had in the little diagrams, like, okay, cool, the guy that's above is favored to win, but the guy below has still maintained a positional, like, neutrality. He didn't lose a lot by playing the way that he did. And at this point, we're speeding it up by a factor of 10, because this is why I don't really practice this, because it's not really relevant outside of tournaments. But Sam is going to slowly whittle down Jerry, and this is going to be just 10 minutes of kind of flat turns with little minute ups and downs, a little bit of flap management, and a lot of just kind of rudder control, a lot of conserving energy and maintaining the absolute perfect amount of angle of attack. And this is, I don't practice this because I don't have the patience for it. I want to attack things, so this is why we're just going to get this. But even if as it's speeding up, you can see that Sam has gained position on Jerry, even at the bottom, even if it just looked like it was nothing but flat turns. Jerry's going to pitch up here because he's hoping that maybe Sam misses and he gets a follow-up, but that's not going to be the case. He only goes for one attack, and that one attack is a very easy attack to hit. And that's typically the philosophy behind like a more passive dueling style. Anyways, we're gonna finish it up with another aggro duel. If you liked the video, if you found it informative, like the channel, subscribe to it. If not, I don't really give a shit. Like, go touch grass. And we fly through. I don't even remember how this one ends. I think he gets the attack here. I think I fly through guns and die. Yep, I fly through guns and die. Rip me, rip Bozo. Anyways, that's the video. Goodbye.